Fáilte a Maria Gillen. This is episode 59 of the Rebel Matters podcast, and I've just spent the last hour or so in the room here with the candles burning away, incense going, and listening back to the chat that I had with Maria Gillen, who is today's guest on the podcast. Maria is a storyteller, a drama therapist, a member of the Cork Yarn-Spinners, and we recorded this chat kind of as part of the little series that I was working on the subject of folklore and mythology. And there's been a great response to last week's episode with Steve Lally, so thanks very much to everyone who listened to that there. And to keep with the theme of storytelling, folklore, mythology, and also to keep with the theme of making December a lovely healing and positive month, I thought that this would be the perfect time to release this episode. You're really going to enjoy it. Thanks first of all to Colleen Jones, who trains at Ackley and who's the person who sent me the contact details for Maria. So without Colleen, this episode would not be happening. So Garamila Magat. In this episode we talked about loads of different stuff. We talked about how there is strength and softness, the silent hand, how drama therapy can be used in conflict areas and with people who have suffered from traumatic things or when traumatic things are going on, how storytelling can be cathartic, how it can be used to hand down knowledge. We talked about technology and how it could be impacting us today, and the effects of modern economics might have on the passing down of wisdom from generation to generation. And we also touched on the representation of women in Irish folklore. Maria told a good few short stories as part of this podcast, and for me the real highlight of the podcast is towards the end when Maria tells the story that came to her one night about the fox. And just listening back to it now, it was making me have all the feels when I was listening to that story. I think it's going to resonate with a lot of people in terms of how we see ourselves and how we want to be seen and how much we love ourselves. And I think the less said about the story the better at this stage, because what I would recommend most is that you take a bit of a time out of your day, and if you can, just sit back and listen to Maria talking about how she became a storyteller and sharing some stories with us, and just have a nice chill out for yourself while you're listening to this episode. What else? It's been a hectic week here. If any of you are out there who follow along with the social media on Ackley, you'll know that Steph, who has poured her heart and soul into running the events and looking after the members and overall helping Ackley develop over the last 7 months or so, is after moving away to Kenya to start her next life adventure. And we're all very happy for her, but at the same time pretty sad. We dropped Steph up to the airport the other day and it was pretty emotional. Myself and Steph have been pretty much joined at the hip for the last half of a year or more. So just going to use this little opportunity to say more to Steph, and we all miss you already. And that happened. Then what else was going on there? I went to see Talos last week in St. Luke's, which is a class music venue in Cork, run by Joe and Ed. And if you ever get a chance to go there, I would highly recommend it. The Talos gig was class. Then went to see them again on Sunday, and then we had a big party afterwards, which was great. And then it's just been a mental week getting ready for the end of the year at Ackley and organising the various bits and pieces that need to be done before the end of the year. But the best thing about this week so far has just been bumping into people that I haven't seen in ages and getting the opportunity to chat with people that we might not necessarily get that much time together because we're all like ships in the night. And so I think that's the most positive thing about the festive season, really, getting to meet people that you don't normally see, and hopefully getting a bit of time to chill out for yourself, which is the thing that kind of brought the idea of Healing December to mind. So I'm still getting really good feedback about that Healing December episode, which was not the last one, but the one before that, episode 57. So if you want to hear me talking away about the importance of making December a month where you put your mental and physical health to the fore, then go back and have a wee listen to that there. So before we get stuck into the episode with Maria, I've actually got a big massive bottle of handcrafted traditional porter from the Dingle Peninsula. It's called Cork, made by the West Kerry Brewery and given to me by the one and only Sarah Anderson, or Sarah Moves as she's better known on social media. I'm going to actually just open it here. This is one of those kind of like bottles that you pull the metal kind of lever thing and it pops open, so hopefully it's going to make a nice sound. And I'm going to put it up to the microphone here. It smells unreal. I'm just going to pour it out here and then we'll get stuck into this episode with Maria. Oh, holy crap, that is delicious. Unreal. You should check that stuff out, lads. It's magnificent. Pure Cork from the West Kerry Brewery, and thanks a million to Sarah Anderson for hooking me up with that beautiful bottle of stuff. Alright, lads, so as usual at the end of the episode, if you want a little bit of a story time, then I'm going to be there after the outro music, reading a little bit of Roald Dahl's book, Boy Tales of Childhood. We've been reading a chapter after each episode since episode 52. So if you want to hear the start of that book, then you'll have to go back to episode 52 and go on to the part of the podcast that's after the outro music, and you'll get the chapters for every subsequent episode from there on in. But in the meantime, lads, really sit back and enjoy this episode of the Rebel Matters podcast with Maria Gillen.
I heard the story Oma Ahir, if you haven't the Gaelga, well sure this time it doesn't matter. This rural Ireland tragic tale relates a sad seductive scale about lust without discretion agus beagnach ruddy eile freshen. Long ago, fado, in a little town name of Caharrow lived Buchelman name of Mihal Moore, an only son of 44. And when work was done at the end of the day, he'd settle down with cup on tea and never felt the need to stroll or spend an evening time at goal. His intellectual needs were drawn from big books like Peg and Iasagan, and so it was, blian in, blian out, our Mihal hardly moved about. He dreamt of Colleen, most men do, but never sinned on digging to. So when I'd be working with school refusers and they tell me they'd no Irish, I go, I'll tell you this so, and if you laugh, I know you have Irish. And that was an opener to bring the Irish in. And my Irish would kind of say, get me a bed for the night, get me food, kind of stuff, like my French. It wouldn't be as good as to put a bloss on the language, like Paddy, do you know?
Yeah,
so
and most people do have that bit of Irish in their back pocket somewhere.
Exactly. But if you use it, up it comes again, and the storytellers are committed to that. So in Seachtain na Gaeilge or Bliain na Gaeilge, we'll give it our best. And I went to some of the Irish circles and stuff like that and told stories and said, you'll have to help me now, you know. But there's one beautiful story about the Irish language, and it's about the difference between the armies. So they say that the Irish warriors and the British warriors, they were always, you know, kind of head to head. And there was 1,000 years of peace, and the warriors were like, we're going to lose our skills, what will we do? So they had kind of like an Olympics games, and the old enemies came down to be the last two, the Irish and the English. And the Irish language, we'd say, a feeling is upon me, Tá ocras orm. But the English, they'd say, I'm hungry, and their whole being is hungry in that moment because they don't separate themselves out at all. But as well as that, the Irish would send their young warriors out at the age of 7 to lie on the horse's heart. So the horse became their friend and comrade in the field. But the British, they would put divisions, just like they did with the armies, with the captains and all of this, So they would order their men and they would order their animals. So they put 2 horses on either side of the field and the 2 warriors, and they were to bring the horses across the field, and it was going to be a timed event. And the Englishman said, "Come here, right now, horse!" And the horse reared back and his eyes rolled in his head from fear. And then he came galloping across the field because he would be afraid of his master. And then the Irish fella, he stood and he looked at his horse from across the field and he went, "Taran Shoma Kushla, Taran Shoma Cree," like that. And the horse just sailed across the field. But that moment of not rearing back and just coming across the field meant that the Irish won. So there's an awful lot of strength in softness. That's the moral of the story. So there's loads of bits and pieces like that.
Yeah. What was it about storytelling that first kind of grabbed your imagination?
Oh, I suppose for me, I've grown up listening to stories because my mother would teach us through story. And I remember, I'm not sure if you remember this, but in the 1980s, the grid in Ireland became under pressure. So very often we'd have outages of power, and you would come home and she'd light a candle in a jam jar in the middle of the table. And she'd say, "Come on to the story sofa and I'll take you away." And that's exactly what would happen. And of all my childhood memories, that's the one I miss most, that I'd like to go back to.
Do you have any particular stories that you remember from back in the day?
Oh, I have great stories. They had a pet name for World War II in Cork, and it was called the Emergency.
I've heard that before.
And there's loads of stories about that. And one of my favourite stories is something called the Silent Hand. Have you ever heard of the Silent Hand?
No.
Okay, so the Silent Hand says you don't bring shame down on poverty, and that everybody was in a poor situation at the time. So you wouldn't say, "Oh, I see you're in trouble there. Would you like a loan of £20 or whatever, Instead, you'd say, "Oh, look at me. I'm so stupid. I made too much stew. Will you take some off my hands?" They would do it that way. And one of the older women, because I collect stories from the older women in Cork, one of them said, "Sure, girl, if someone dies belong to you now, your head is full of how am I going to organise for the soup and the sandwiches, in a time when you should be remembering back to the times, the gorgeous times that you have with your loved one." And she said the Silent Hand would say that you opened your door, you closed the curtains, you opened the windows as soon as the soul died so they could get out through the window. Then you closed the curtains, but the windows were open, and you opened your door, and people came in, and they brought with them sandwiches and soup, and they said one woman would be in control of the beautiful tablecloth, the lace tablecloth, and she would wrap it in blue paper, brown paper first, then blue paper to keep the colour. But at important occasions, it would just appear on the table, and so you didn't have to worry about how your house looked or what would be on the table, because all of that was taken care of by the Silent Hand.
A lot of those stories connected with handing down traditions and customs,
yeah,
as opposed to just being a pure old story just for the sake of it.
Absolutely, so. And I also work with a mechanism called a 6-part story, because I'm a drama therapist. So this mechanism comes from a gentleman by the name of Mooley Lahad, and he would go into war-torn areas or places that were devastated by natural phenomenon like the tsunamis and things like that, and often he'd be the first responder, and people are so clenched from shock that the only way to reach them is through the stories. And I found these stories were very important when when we went through our downturn, particularly with young men. So I would have worked a lot in the desh areas of Cork City, And I found as a therapist, sitting down belly button to belly button and eyeball to eyeball with a man doesn't work. But if you have a project that you're working on together and you're shoulder to shoulder, then it works, you know. And there's some beautiful stories that came out of that. And some of the gentlemen were saying, tell these stories because they're so important that they save lives. And one of those stories that I tell is an amalgam of stories for young men. You know, it's about this boy who was, I'll give you the helicopter view rather than the full story, but it's about this young boy who was born on the outskirts of Cork City, and he was beloved of his grandparents because his mom was a single mother, and his role model was his grandfather. And when his grandfather died, the grandmother died as well because, you know, they were so close that she couldn't live without him. And then the mother sold the house and moved into the centre of Cork City. And it was just at the time that this young boy was leaving primary school, going into secondary school. And he grew so fast that he became one of the biggest boys in the class very quickly, and an object for bullying, because the biggest one is the one that gets called out all the time, even though he had a very gentle nature. And the men of the time, the men in the men's shed said, sure, we all went through that when we were young fellas, you know. And what you do is you say something smart, and while he's waiting, while he's trying to think of an answer, you get to walk away with dignity, you know. So practicing that then with the young men, you know, kind of in the therapy situation, meant that they started to use their words and their head instead of their fists, and it brought real change really quickly. And that was from a story, you know, that had grown out of doing the 6-part story. It was a big trend of bullying that was going on, you know, kind of in the schools at the time.
It's interesting that you mentioned the storytelling and drama has a role in, say, war-torn areas or areas that have conflict in them, because
Absolutely.
actually, so I'm from West Belfast, and my dad was involved in setting up initially an amateur theatre company. And I mean, they must have set it up in the early 90s or maybe even before that, but they transitioned to a professional company 21 years ago now, actually. But and that was at a time when there was a lot of conflict going on up in Belfast at the time, and I think that the drama has played a pretty key role in giving people an outlet to express themselves.
Yeah,
through those times. It was quite a difficult time as well.
Absolutely. That gladdens my heart so much, you know, kind of, because I really believe in the ability of drama to touch parts of people that can't be touched. And when I tell corporate stories, I go into the corporate environment, and it's very heavily concentrated on the intellect. So I look at a thing called piles: physical, intellectual, language, emotional, social and spiritual, which is exactly what you're talking about. But there is a huge link between Cork and Belfast. Did you know that?
In what way?
So when I was in school, I remember going in one day and I had a desk to myself, and when I went in on this morning, I had one girl on one side of me and one girl on the other side, and they were the Donnelly twins from Belfast, and they'd come down through the night, you know. And so with them, they brought their songs and their stories and their beautiful accent, and so a big connection was made between Cork and Belfast. It would have been in the late 70s, early 80s that would have happened, and it was because people had to leave in traumatic circumstances
to come down
and reroute. Yeah, you know. So I look at all of the instability in the world today, and I say, you know, that would have been my personal experience of that. But there was a beautiful story that came with them called Rosie Brown. Are you familiar with it? You know, so it starts off with, I was born and bred in Sandy Row, a royal orange prod, a follower of King William, that noble man of God, a man of no surrender, may flag the Union Jack, and every year I proudly marched to Finnehy and back. As well as that, a Linfield man as I could mind, he had no time for people, or Catholics or people of that kind. Then one night down in Bangor, I met with Rosie Brown, and the minute I set eyes on her, my heart went up and down. Now, I worked in a company called PJ Hagerty's, and it was full of men and very few women. I would have started work there in 1985, so a long time ago.
The year I was born.
Was it?
Yeah.
Oh my God, so a long time ago. And The men, you know, kind of like a lot of builders would be very stoic, you know, and wouldn't show an awful lot of emotion. Banter would have been how they expressed themselves. But once a year, they used to have this big session organised by Murphy's Brewery, who were one of our clients at the time. And a beautiful man called Jim Devine would tell that story. And the men felt absolutely comfortable to show emotion, and there'd be tears rolling down their face to that story, Rosie Brown.
That story is interesting because the Sandy Row place that you mentioned is a place that we would never go.
Exactly.
For fear of your life.
Yeah.
For a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And Finicky, actually, my dad lives in Finicky at the minute, but did you mention the link between Cork and Belfast? In Milltown Cemetery, which is the main cemetery in West Belfast, really, there is a huge plot of kind of unmarked graves of mostly people who would have travelled to Belfast to work in the mills and stuff, and people who died who they didn't know, you know, like where they came from and stuff like that. But there's actually a cross there, and I think it's from 1947 or something like that, of a woman who had come from Cork to work in the mills in Belfast and is buried there. And another connection, actually, now that as soon as we're talking about it, but my dad learned to speak Irish in St Mary's in Belfast, and it was actually a Cork man who was teaching him.
Oh.
So his brother Bozang.
Oh, I love Brother. That's a great personal connection between the two of us.
But there was two of them.
Yeah.
So there was one of them was teaching in Cork.
Yeah.
And one of them was teaching in Belfast.
Did he stay in Belfast all his life?
I don't know. Like, I'd have to find out. Now, I think there was two of them, or was just one of them.
Well, we had a very famous brother, Bozan, and he was involved in the RS here in Cork in the Mardyke, and he was a great man for getting you to use the little bit of Irish that was locked in the back of your head. That's what he would say. And he spent some years, I believe, in Belfast, but then he also taught down here in Cork.
He was teaching in Sculborough in AG.
Yeah.
And up in Firhill or up around there.
Yeah, and I think it was the Mon.
The Mon, sorry,
down
that's
here.
It was the Mon, yeah.
So, but what a lovely man, what a gentleman, and how he communicated through story was absolutely amazing. You know,
yeah, it'd be interesting to try and trace those roots back now. Whenever he was in Belfast and teaching boys in school, and now like all the stuff that's developed from that group of people that came through that system of like learning Irish in Belfast it's the 70s, I guess. Yeah.
Oh, well, I would have bumped into him, I'd say, in around 92, you know. So it could be the same man, you know. So
what's the importance of storytelling in terms of today's society?
Okay, so first of all, story will tell the untellable. So it will look at zeitgeist, and it will look at it under a bright white light like nothing else can, you know. So this state, when the Republic of Ireland was born, it was born from poets and storytellers, and they were, you know, looking at the world in a new way and using language that showed the world up for what it was at the time. And I think we need a really big dose of that right now, you know. But also there was something called catharsis that the ancient Greeks knew about. So I don't know if you've ever had a really tough day and you're absolutely exhausted, and then you come in and you're reading a good book, or you watch Coronation Street, or you go to a good film, and in reality nothing has changed, but also everything has changed because suddenly you feel better. And that's the ability of a story, in whatever form you take it, to take you away, to allow you to look at things from a distance, a different perspective, and then to come back and to be changed within yourself. So that's catharsis, you know, and story is full of catharsis.
And are there lessons there from back in the ages in some of the stories that you're telling that people can apply to
absolutely life? Yeah, you know, I mean, I suppose one of the most famous ones that comes to my head is one of the Greek stories about a crow who comes across a broken jug, and there's water in the jug, but his beak is not long enough. So he looks around and he finds the stones, and he puts the stones into the jug, and the water level rises bit by bit. And the moral of the story is that necessity is the mother of invention. That story is over 2,000 years old. And then if we look at the Quran and the Bible and all of the holy books, how old are they? And the scrolls, you know. And those are all very much story-based. And the first societies that were born in the cradle of humanity, which again would have been back in Greece and Rome, you know, kind of when people were trying to figure out what a society was, how did they do it? You know, so remember the amphitheatres, some of them that still exist to this day. What they would do is they would get massive masks, you know, almost as big as a man, and they'd parade through the city, and they would say, if you're good and you keep the rules, this will happen, and they'd show a heavenly vista. But if you're bad and you don't obey the rules, this will happen, and they'd show us Hades or hell, you know, and they did that through the voice, with the choruses, and through the imagery, and through musical instruments, and all joined together through story. So, yeah.
There's a shanachal that represents that story about the jug and the big moon and gas shaft.
I haven't heard that.
So that's the necessity breeds the
invention.
The invention, yeah.
Brilliant, yeah.
Do you feel like we're becoming more and more technologically orientated now? Like, and is there a counter movement back to our roots and our folklore and our storytelling now?
Well, no, you're talking to the work that I've done since 2007. So I worked with the Sexual Health Centre in Cork for a number of years, and we'd go out to the schools, and we were noticing that children were first of all bullying one another outside of school hours also. So the bullying was coming through on technology and stuff like that, you know, but also getting addicted to it. And we did some studies, and we realised that technology lights up the same centre of the brain as cocaine, you know. So, and the technology is so new that these studies haven't been looked at in any great depth yet, or reproduced in many areas of the world, you know. So I was working with, you know, children who were contemplating and were self-harming, and were contemplating, you know, suicide and stuff like that. And I was going, oh my God, these are children, you know. And what I realised was that the internal landscape that was fed so much for me by my mother through story was missing for the kids, and that they depended on the technology to be able to access colour and, you know, form and excitement, and couldn't close their eyes and do that. So we would work on story building, and again I used Mooley Lahad's 6-part story hugely in this context, you know, and within a very short space of time, you know, within 1 or 2 sessions, these kids were making the most fantastical stories, and the stories were getting kinder and kinder. And I was absolutely amazed at that, because a lot of technology leads us to the excitement of trauma instead of to the nourishment of kindness. So I was very interested in that during that time.
Is that a case of moving more towards, like, is technology kind of filling a vacuum or something that has been left by moving away from more like oral and more oral traditions, and then that we're getting addicted to technology, which in a way is taking the space of storytelling? Is that the way it is, or? Well,
I suppose in my life as a storyteller, I see people taking part in stories all the time, you know. But I'm also from a technological background, and I would have been 22 years in a corporate environment, you know. And I found that people loved to tell their own story, to look up from their computer and to tell you what was going on in their life, but they didn't know how to do it because we're beginning to lose our social skills. So then I myself, when I was in that environment, and I was feeling the strain of that myself, I would go to places, you know, I was living in Dublin at the time, so the Merchant O'Shea, I'd go down there, and I went in through set dancing, but I met the storytellers there, and I found, as a European ops manager with an Irish accent, wherever I went, people expected me to start a session or a sing-song, you know, and sure, I was only too happy to oblige, you know.
Especially being from Cork, if you have the gift of the gab.
It completely in my blood, completely, you know, and that people loved it. They were only looking for an excuse. So one time I went to Sweden for a symposium, and I said, you know, they asked me to start a session, and I did, and I got all the managers involved and stuff. And the next year they said, we really want to bring the symposium to Ireland for the tradition of story. Look at how powerful that was, you know, and that's what happened, you know. So I think people are only looking for the excuse. And if we can learn to use technology as a tool instead of as an end product, then it could be very useful to story, you know. So I could imagine being able to access storytellers, you know, over the web that I wouldn't be able to access.
Well, this is going to be going on the internet as well.
Exactly, you know. And I listen to David Allison's story podcast all the time, and I'm hoping this is another one that will take off, because we need story. And there's nothing like, you know, people talk about, and there's a great place for this, don't get me wrong, but, you know, kind of apps like a Calm, you know, and I love them and I use them from time to time, but I like nothing better than getting into bed, lighting a candle and putting on a story podcast and being taken away by a story, you know.
And do you think there is a danger that we are in danger of losing our social skills and our social skills being reduced because of how dependent we're coming on technology? Yeah,
I have great faith in humanity and its ability to survive. And especially with the kids, you know, I love going, I tell stories for children every Sunday, and we've been making stories together. So we have stories like Grumpy Gob and the Fairies of Fitzgerald's Park, you know, and the dragon on top of St. Finbarr's Cathedral, things like that, you know, and these come out of the children and they get so excited by them. And if you tell them and you miss a detail that they are after putting in, they won't be long saying, no, it was a blue cloak, not a red cloak, that kind of thing, you know. So I think that as long as that hunger and joy of story is in our children, we're safe and it's there, you know.
At the minute I'm reading a biography about Bobby Sands, Nothing But an Unfinished Song, and obviously a lot of that biography is centred around the time that he spent on in the H-blocks and on No Wash protest and the Dirty protest and on the hunger strike as well.
Yeah.
And one of the key, well, if you read any of those sort of prison literature that came out from around about that time, that the constant theme in every single piece of work is that the storytelling played a key role.
Yeah.
Every night that the prisoners were telling stories to each other through the doors of the cells.
Yeah.
And that there would be people who would be very good at recounting stories.
Yeah.
And even how they got the stories in.
Yeah.
Because they weren't allowed books, so they were getting bits and pieces from the outside of stories and then piecing it together and then getting up to the door to shout the story down to the rest of the wing.
Yeah, and sing it.
Singing as well.
They sang stories and they were absolutely amazing. And there's something about an Irish story in song that gives it a different depth and allows it to be remembered over generations and generations and generations, you know. And I remember well Bobby Sands being in prison. I was alive at that time and I was living in Mayfield, and it was really in our consciousness, and it wasn't in our consciousness through TV, which we didn't get to see until 6 o'clock in the evening. It wasn't through news story, it was through the stories that were coming down from the people that had come, you know, during that time. It was from the pictures on the walls. You remember those big paintings, you know? And it was from the stories. And then I think of the women, you know, kind of, you talk about the stories being, you know, shouted down through the prison halls and things like that. And I think of the women in Belfast with the ash can, you know, the trash cans, banging them, you know, to bring it to the attention of the world, and how they joined together, you know, when it was dangerous and life-threatening to do that, you know. And I think of Liz Weir, who got her MBE for stories, you know. It didn't matter what part of the divide you were on. If you were a child, you deserved stories. And it started like that, through telling the stories. But she got very involved in the peace process and in how peace could be brought and bought through stories, you know. And then, you know, kind of the men who led, who turned, like, I mean, what a great story that was in the end, you know. Like the Martin McGuinness, and you had Ian Paisley, and you had Jerry Adams talking in a room together, you know. And this was like a great operetta that we'd all seen play out. This will never happen, you know. And then it did. And when that happened, then the whole world wanted to know about the story, because it felt like the story was coming to an end. how can we use that going forward for other countries that are in conflict? And it really excites my long experience as a crisis manager to look at things like that and see how those people who did a U-turn leadership thing, look at that for a story. How could we use that, in the Syrias of today and, kind of those places?
It's interesting that you mentioned the possibility of stories crossing over to other cultures and other countries, because that's a bit of a theme in the folklore stories.
Yeah.
They cross over from country to country
big time.
as well.
Yeah.
And I was actually going to ask you about how are throughout the ages how have women been represented in the folklore tales, especially like, say, for example, in Irish mythology?
Yeah, well, I suppose we had some great women like Maeve, the pirate queen, and Grania Whale, and Morrigan, the shapeshifter and stuff like that. So I've had great strong women in my life in role modeling stories always because of that. But also I learnt strong moral lessons by hearing the stories of the women in my line who came down through the ages. So I know stories of my grandmother, who was a woman of the knowing, who had a cure for mumps and measles when there was no antibiotics. The story of my grandmother, who was put into service to a family in Cove, and she ran away, and Cork was occupied at the time, so she came into an occupied city, and she was missing the curfew, and she was taken by a woman with a shawl, and her life began for her from that moment. So it's about not being afraid to do the things that need to be done, even if they're not smiled on by your society, but also keep the rules when you can. So I suppose that's encapsulated in the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world.
How did you get those stories about your relatives going back in the generations?
My great grandmother lived to be over 100 years old, and I went up to see her. Isn't that amazing? So and then my grandaunts, my grandmother's sisters, would have been telling me those stories while I was there. My grandmother's story would have been told to me proudly by my mother, kind of when we were growing up. And my grandmother herself would tell you tales to keep you safe. One of the tales was never walk near the walls, kind of on a dark street, never walk near walls or doorways. And my mother would have been told this before us, and she was walking along a bombed out site in London in the 60s, before any of her children were born. And this man jumped out from a doorway, and if she had been walking on the footpath near the houses, she would have been in serious trouble altogether, But the funny part of that story is, she said, when I heard it, I heard it secondhand, and I heard about the blackened hand that would come out of the wall. And she says it turns out it wasn't a blackened hand at all. It was talk about the black and tans. So the blackened hand. Right. So that's what it became over time, But yeah, to this day, I don't walk in near the walls, So yeah.
You mentioned the women around Cork and stuff like that there, and the stories that they had. And there was a friend of mine actually who I used to go down and visit, who has got an amazing story, and I've got a few old recordings with him on a podcast episode back. Mick Murphy, he was known as the Iron Man, and he used to do circus tricks in the Cold Key. And he became very friendly with the Shawleys around there, and got a lot of stories from them, and that must have been in the 50s or something like that.
Yeah. So they still have a great tradition of brilliant stories, and are very proud of it, and very protective of the stories that they have. And I would have done a lot of story gathering from the women of Cork, say of Granabraher and Blarney Street and the marshes and stuff like that, And the stories that they have to tell are absolutely amazing. And it boggles my mind that there is a divide between those women who have all this knowledge and wisdom and the young mothers of today. So a lot of my work is gathering these stories and feeding them back to where they will be useful, And
why do you think there is a divide there?
A lot of it is economic, So like my mum and the moms of Mayfield when I was growing up didn't go out to work, So you had your mother to come home to. Then my generation, including myself, went out to work and took our right to be able to do that. But then you give up a certain, you give up. It's a trade-off. So if you're going to be at work, you're not going to be at home, and you're not going to be connecting with your community. So you would be connecting with your work colleagues instead, and that's very different. So you're not passing on, kind of mother wisdoms. You're passing on what smart goals and how to reach your corporate goals.
And that's a real thing, isn't it? That especially with the big American kind of companies, that they foster that environment to try and create a kind of family atmosphere.
Yeah.
But in reality, it's not a family.
No. They're
your work colleagues.
Yeah.
So what is the importance of bridging that gap that you're trying to get the stories from the older generation to the younger generation?
I'm going to tell you a true story. So there was a terrible situation going on in the schools of Cork City, where mothers had to turn up looking like a yummy mummy with the hair perfectly done and the gel nails and stuff like that. And it was at a time when there wasn't enough money to put food on the tables. And I said to those women, why are you doing that? And they said, because if you don't keep up the standards, your children will be bullied in school. So I went back to the older women and I told them that story. And they said, that's leaving the children run the nation, girl. You can't be doing that. And I said, that's lovely, but how do we stop? And they said, sure, you use the sure what about it? And I said, what's the sure what about it? But as they said it, those words kind of had a tintinnabulation of memory even in my own head, and I was thinking, I've heard that before. And they says, well, and I said to them, you don't have the pressures that these young women have, because the television is constantly, throwing adverts out at them. We're back to technology again, And they said, oh, listen, girl, do you think that the big brown parcels didn't come from America and England? And I said, oh, yeah, I remember them coming. And they said, yeah, and one house would get a big parcel and all the other houses would be looking on with hungry eyes through the net curtains. And then someone might come out and they might have a beautiful bit of style on from New York. And they'd be going, look at this from New York. And we'd say, sure, what about it? And then they had two choices. You get back into your box, which I hadn't heard in a long time, or you boast more. And no one in Cork loves a boaster, girl. And they were so right. So I was telling the young women this, and they went, well, that won't work, that might have worked back then. But they were obviously chatting about it at their sinks and making the dinner and stuff like that. And it went into the kids. And one of the kids went into school, and this child came over and she went, Reebok, €60, because I'm worth it. And this other child went, sure, what about it? And she described to me and all how the girl's head started to shake with shock, and she was making the big O with her mouth, and she just didn't have a comeback for that. So she went home, and of course the parents were like, you go in and you tell them you're from a two-income family, and all the other stuff that we had to listen to during the rich, inverted commas, times in Ireland, So she came back in, and this is the miracle of story, because you give the first one to teach, but the second one comes for free. So the girl came in the following day and she was going, two-income family, blah, blah, blah. And the other girl was listening to her and she was, oh, yeah, because you're worth it, because you're from a two-income family, blah, blah, blah. And she goes, yeah. She says, because they saw you coming. She says, do you know you could get the same thing down in pennies in 5 different colours and still have enough money to go to the pictures? Because you're worth it, because they saw you coming. And that was how the story took root in the new generation. How miraculous is that? Isn't that brilliant?
And all those little phrases as well. Like,
yeah.
What about, and like, every city in Ireland, every area of Ireland probably has their own version of those.
Absolutely.
Like, I think in Belfast, like, you hear someone saying, catch yourself on.
Exactly. Yeah. So catch yourself on. How appropriate for this story. Why aren't we catching ourselves on?
Yeah.
We all know that this, that we're being brainwashed by advertisement. So we should catch ourselves on.
You mentioned earlier that you kind of have a special connection with stories kind of like of the land and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So how did you get that interest?
I suppose through set dancing. First of all, because I'd be listening to them for years, and then I found that a lot of have you heard of Clarissa Pinkola Estes and the woman who run with wolves?
Oh yeah, the woman who runs wolves.
Yeah,
I actually got that in the house. I haven't started reading it yet.
I picked that up like a book of gems, and I just thumbed through it, and wherever my thumb stops, I read the story that day. And she's that woman. She translates the stories into a Jungian translation of them, and I'm just fascinated by the stories themselves, but also by the hidden meanings that are in them. And with these stories of the land, like I tell a fox story that came to me through, kind of a methodology of harvesting stories from the pre-conscious, which is, they say it's a drama therapeutic tool, but actually I think it's a humanity tool that we've been using since the dawn of time, And this story... Is
that like before you were aware of yourself as a person, kind of like when you're 2 years old or something like that? Is that
no? But if you actually kind of half close your eyes and you think of a theme and you listen for a story, then a story can come to you like that. And I'm sure you've heard of the Stolen Note, Seamus Heaney and the Stolen Note. So this is about how music can come to you in its entirety, and it's actually given to you by the Sidhe or by the fairies. When it comes like that, it feels as if it's that you didn't sit down and use your brain to create a story. And this story that I have of Mordre Rua, which is a story of an affinity between a woman and a fox, came to me like that. I didn't sit down and carve out the story. The story came to me like a dream, but I was awake when it happened. So that's what I'm talking about there, But when I tell that story, and I've told it in many different places, there isn't one time that goes by where somebody doesn't approach to me and say, that story was meant for me. And I believe it every time. Every time somebody says that to me, I go, that story was meant for you.
What's the gist of the story?
It's a story about how this beautiful woman, and from the outside, when people were looking at her and her life, they were going, some people are charmed and they just have everything. But she had a sad, sharp secret that lived in the bottom of her heart. And it was that she really wanted a child of her own to fill her arms, And she had a man that she loved, and he loved her, but they couldn't have a child, and she had a room in her house ready for that child to come, and she would say her mantras every day and, put all the pressure on herself that a lot of women do, and there was no sign of the child coming. And then she woke up one morning and her Anam Cara, her soul friend, was waiting in the mist for her, the red fox on Mordre Rua, the red dog, And she's putting on her coat and her wellies, and she's going out into the mist, and she knows exactly where the fox is because the affinity is drawing her in. And she kneels down to look into the eyes of the fox, and something happens that has never happened before. Her spirit leaves her body, and her hand goes into the front paw of the fox, and her other hand goes into the other front paw of the fox, and her eyes come behind the eyes of the fox, and now she can see through the eyes of the fox. And she can see like she's never seen before. And she can sense that in the field just to the right of her, there is a sheep, and that there's chickens just to the left of her, and they're nervous. She even knows they're nervous because they sense her back. And then she sticks her fox tongue into the river, and when she does that, she can taste a little bit of lavender and wild garlic and the salmon that has been here only minutes before. And then she feels that she's being called down into the earth. So she goes into the forest that she's wandered so many times before, but it looks completely different. And she sees a hole in the base of the tree that she has never seen before. And she enters the hole and she goes down into the heart of the earth. And her eyes start to adjust, and she sees stars under the earth. And she's thinking, stars under the earth? That's not possible. And then she thinks, I'm in the body of a fox. Anything is possible. And then she realises they're not stars, but 6 cubs waiting for their mother to come home. And they attack her with joy because she is in the body of the mother. And they bite her on the neck to say hello, and they suckle, and she lies down, and Her spine is held by the back of the lair under the ground. And in that moment, she knows what it is to be a mother. And she knows that she would stand between these cubs and any danger that are coming in the way. And after a while, she thinks, that's the lesson. That's why I was brought here. And as soon as that thought comes into her head, the fox gets up and brings her in spirit back up through the earth to the opening and back to her garden. And the spirits separate. And she looks at the fox and she says, thank you, Ma Anam Cara, thank you so much. But also the fox looks at her again and she realises there's something that she needs to hear from me. And she goes, I know what I must do. And she runs into the house and up the stairs and she takes everything apart in that room that's held for the children, and she buys the best art materials that she can find, and she opens it up to the children of the village, and they all love being in Moira Rua's house, and it's filled with laughter. And over time she became Sean Leah. Instead of on Moira Rua, she became Sean Leah. And people would remember that she would hold on to their art pieces that they made when they were 3 or 4 years of age. And she would frame them and she would give it to them on the occasion of their wedding or something like this, like the real treasures that they were. And she discovered that you don't have to have a baby from your own body to be a mother. And the village discovered that it takes more than one person to raise a child. So that's the story.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah,
That's amazing.
Absolutely. But the reactions to that story are amazing, because women have come up to me and said, I feel a lot of pressure to have a child now and I'm not ready. And this story tells me that I don't have to be. And I'm like, look at that. That's amazing. And then other women will come up and they'll say, I can't have kids myself. And I realise now that I don't need to have children myself, and and that's what they would take out of it, so it's like the difference of the heart message that somebody receives from the very same story. You could be telling a story to 30 people and 30 different messages will go out, and that's when a story is medicinal.
That listening to that kind of exemplifies in a way how broad an application storytelling has, or how broadly it's everywhere, and that you could be telling a story, a bedtime story that's just kind of like messing around, or you could be telling a story to a group of 100 people, and then I guess like that story in a way, does that it kind of shows the importance of the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves.
Absolutely,
in a way.
Yeah.
Would that be the kind of work that you would be doing in the drama therapy?
So you talked about drama and how important it was earlier, and one of the things we look at in drama is endings. So there was a big old debate on the radio recently saying, we shouldn't be telling, those archetypal stories of women being subservient, things like Cinderella. And I was saying, just change the endings, make her the warrior. Stories that's why I don't like to read a story in a book and learn it off. So instead you just pick out the story from the book, the bit that remains in your heart, and you tell that. And then you say, now if I changed it and I changed the ending, would that change anything? And actually what it does is it changes world views. So how a story is told can change a world view. So a great example of that is Disney and what he did to the Grimm's fairy tales. He took all of the Grimm out of the fairy tales, and he made them very charming, but not with a lot of lesson or substance in them,
Yeah, and when I think back at a lot of the Irish kind of folklore tales or myths, a lot of the women in those stories aren't subservient. They're all warriors, and most of the time casting a spell on some fella who's been misbehaving or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
So where did that come from then? At what stage along the line did that start to change?
Well, I'll tell you now. I was listening to Daniel and Alison's stories this morning. And one of the stories that he tells is about the kiss of the crow to Cuchulainn, and it's about Morriganna and how she was the goddess of war. And he says, I wonder, are there bits missing? And I was wondering away myself as well. And there's the archetype of woman has changed, But back in the early days of Ireland, she was just as important, just as powerful as the men, you know. So she goes to give Cuchulainn a kiss, and Cuchulainn says no, but he says he's under her spell and he's about to kiss her, and then there's that caw of the crow, but she is the crow. So did she cause the caw because she didn't want to kiss him as well? So then she pushes him to kiss her, and that brings up the battle rage, you know, the bloodlust and stuff like that. So and through that he puts down the enemies. So there's more than one way for an interaction to bring about a result. It can be through love, or it can be through manipulation, or it can be through a teaching methodology. And I think both men and women have the capacity to do that.
Do you think that those stories that we've been told since we were, you know, like in the cut, about Cuchulainn and the Fianna and you know, Clan Lyra and all those real big kind of well-known folk tales and mythology kind of tales, do you think that they impact us? Do you think that as Irish people we have a direct line back to all of those people, and that impacts us as a nation in a way?
Absolutely. I think you just scratch the surface, and we have a tale there, you know. But there, you mentioned, you know, kind of those Fionn McCool and Finnegas, you know, is a very important tale, and for all of my childhood it was a charming tale. And then in Milltown Malbay in the 90s, I met a travelling man called Paddy Joe, and I met Paddy Joe for 3 days because he wouldn't tell me the story in one sitting, and I was absolutely enthralled by it. And I think it was the start of me realising the magic in stories. And he said, this is an initiation stories for boys, but we're losing that. And he said, normally this wouldn't be shared with a woman, but I'm going to share it with you, you know. And he told me the tale of how this boy was so charmed by his mother, and he'd be singing songs, and he was able to do the embroidery and stuff like that, you know. But his father was looking on with worried eyes, thinking he's going to have to run the nation, and he's going to have to know the ways of men, and he had no interest in it. So his father organised for him to be kidnapped and thrown at the feet of Phineas, you know. And that's a bit of the Salmon of Knowledge story that we've lost, you know, and an important bit, you know. So that then that story, along with the story of Iron John, was the basis for my thesis, because I think that in the 1920s, women really needed help to become emancipated politically. And I think in 100 years later, coming up to 2020, men need to be emancipated on an emotional level, you know, with this kind of stuff. And how we operate as beings is very different between a man and a woman. That's why it's in every, you know, kind of indigenous society, you have a shack for men and you have a shack for women. So I think the men's shed is very important, and I think it's very important that women don't invade that. And I'd probably be killed for that, and I'm a feminist, you know. So, but I do believe that there is inequality on both sides, and the inequality for men is that they're emotionally bonded, and that you know, not bonded as in to one another, but that they're bound. You know, and it would be lovely to loose those bones through things like story.
In relation to the lessons that we learn from storytelling, how important is it to keep like the grim parts of the stories in? Very
important. Really important. So there's an awful lot of research done on this, but you know, when you go on to the roller coaster and you're absolutely terrified, but you know you're safe and that all the safety checks are done and stuff like that, and you're going to survive, but you still feel that you know, that's really important, because it teaches us boundaries. But what the stories do extra to that, you know, I'm going to go back to my mom for this one. In the 80s, when we would have the power outages, she'd stick the candle in the middle of sand in a jam jar, and she'd say to us, "Now, while you stay in the light of that candle, you'll be safe and I'll be able to look in your eyes. But if you go into the darkness, I can't be responsible. So there was no way that we were going to leave. And there was 5 of us. And we, like, that's a small Irish family. My grandmother had 9, you know, on one side and 9 on the other. So if you're kind of taking care of that many kids and you want to make sure that they stay around and you can't keep your eyes on them and be a helicopter parent, you have to put the wisdom into them. And you can't just say, stay here, because the first thing a child will do is no. But if you tell them that if they stay within the light of the candle, they're safe, they will do that.
Yeah.
You know, so.
It's, in a way, it's kind of like, from the putting the grim part into the story is kind of like being afraid in a story so that you can handle yourself.
Absolutely.
In the real world. But it's interesting that you were saying that about the staying in the candlelight, because actually a very good friend of mine was telling me a story that her dad used to tell her about the bog.
Yeah.
And how that it was haunted and things like that, and never to go near it.
Oh.
But obviously that story was made so that people, they wouldn't go into the bog and fall into a bog hole and disappear.
Yeah,
but
and related to that, there was the old saying of at night time, the paths are for the living and the fields are for the dead. And it was exactly for that reason, because people could go down a bog hole, you know. So, but if they stayed on the paths, that wouldn't happen, you know. And also you shouldn't be out at night, those stories, you know. So I'm going to ask you a question now. There's 3 kinds of creatures that walk this earth, that are not of this earth. Do you know what they are?
No.
They are the fairies and the Sidhe. They're the souls of those that have died but don't realise they're dead. And then there are the angels that were hurled out of heaven after Satan. Now, if you come across one of these creatures in your everyday life, would you know how to identify them?
I don't think so.
You look at their feet, because they're not supposed to walk this earth. And if both feet are even a centimetre off the ground at the same time, so that one foot is not connected to the earth, then you're in contact with one of these creatures and you should run.
I think that's probably a good place to finish up, and a good lesson for people to take away from this podcast.
Exactly, that's it, you know.
Here, thanks very much for taking the time anyway to do the podcast.
Very welcome, and best of luck with this, and it's really badly needed.
Thank you. So. Just I guess to finish up, is there a way that people can keep track of what you're doing and what you have coming up?
Yeah, I have a Facebook page called Story Seeds, and I'm also a part of Cork Yarn-Spinners, and we meet on the 3rd Thursday of every month in Crawford and Company, which is just across from Anglesey Street Garda Station, but we've never needed the guards. That has never been a problem, you know. And our next one is a very exciting one, because we have David Jackson. And David Jackson combines really ancient Druid stories with spoken word. He's absolutely amazing. So maybe you'll come along and we'll see you there.
The 3rd Thursday of the month.
Yeah, so this month is the 17th.
And then on the last Thursday of the month is our own book club, which is just up the road from...
we'll just have to go to one another's story session. So.
Yeah, thanks very much.
No problem.
What did you think about that, Cork Yarn? I have to say that this really was a very enjoyable episode to record, because I got to go and meet Maria for the first time, and we sat down in the kitchen and had that chat. But also a class episode for me just to be able to listen back to. It really is the reason why I started the Rebel Matters podcast in the first place, was so that I could go around and meet great people like Maria and hear their stories, and also share them with all of you legends out there. So thanks a million for tuning in, and also thanks to everyone who sends in the feedback and comments and stuff like that on social media. It really is good to know that you're out there listening, and I love having your input. Keep on sharing the episodes on your own social media, and tell your mates about it, and also leave us a rating and review wherever you're listening to it, especially if you're listening on iTunes. And if you want to become a patron of the Rebel Matters podcast, then you can go to rebelmatters.ie. There's a link there to the Patreon account, and you can sign up for a little monthly subscription to whatever value that you want to, and that's like really, really appreciated. So Gura Ced Míle Maigad to everyone who has already signed up on the Patreon. I love that people are out there and are willing to support the Rebel Matters podcast to just cover the cost of some of the production of making these shows, like going travelling to meet people and the cost of the production itself with the online softwares that we are subscribed to, and also just to cover the cost of the bits and pieces of equipment that are required to keep the quality of the recordings up to good enough standard so that you guys all enjoy listening to the episodes. But then the Rebel Matters podcast is also free for everybody, so if you're not in a position to support the podcast on Patreon, then just keep on listening and keep on sharing it around. Anyway, that's it from me for this week, except for the bit of Roald Dahl that we have been reading together at the end of the episodes. So I just want to say Cork Yarn-Spinner to Maria for taking the time to record this chat with me and for being such a legend. Go and check her out yourselves, and if you get the opportunity to go and hear her doing her thing anywhere in Cork or further afield, then obviously you should definitely go and do that. But Gajin Kedarala Harjagil Slangafoil. J.D. Varish. This is a chapter from the book Boy Tales of Childhood by Roald Dahl. The first chapter can be found at the end of episode 52 of the Rebel Matters podcast, and this particular chapter is called Captain Hardcastle. This is the first time I've read this book, so we're making our way through it together. We called them masters in those days, not teachers, and at St. Peter's, the one I feared most of all, apart from the headmaster, was Captain Hardcastle. This man was slim and wiry, and he played football. On the football field, he wore white running shorts, white gym shoes, and white socks. His legs were as hard and as thin as ram's legs, and the skin around his calves was almost exactly the colour of mutton fat. The hair on his head was not ginger. It was a brilliant, dark vermilion, like a ripe orange, and it was plastered back with immense quantities of brilliantine in the same fashion as the headmaster's. The parting in his hair was a white line straight down the middle of his scalp, so straight it could only have been made with a ruler. On either side of that parting you could see the comb tracks running back through the greasy orange hair like little tram lines. Captain Hardcastle sported a moustache that was the same colour as his hair, and oh what a moustache it was. A truly terrifying sight, a thick orange hedge that sprouted and flourished between his nose and his upper lip and ran clear across his face from the middle of one cheek to the middle of the other. But this was not one of those nail brush moustaches, all short and clipped and bristly, nor was it a long and droopy in the walrus style. Instead, it was curled most splendidly upwards, all the way along as though it had had a permanent wave put into it, or possibly curling tongs heated in the mornings over a tiny flame of methylated spirits. The only other way he could have achieved this curling effect, we boys decided, was by prolonged upward brushing with a hard toothbrush in front of the looking glass every morning. Behind the moustache there lived an inflamed and savage face with a deeply corrugated brow that indicated a very limited intelligence. Life is a puzzlement, the corrugated brow seemed to be saying, and the world is a dangerous place. All men are enemies, and small boys are insects that will turn and bite you if you don't get them first and squash them hard. Captain Hardcastle was never still. His orange head twitched and jerked perpetually from side to side in the most alarming fashion, and each twitch was accompanied by a little grunt that came out of the nostrils. He had been a soldier in the army in the Great War, and that, of course, was how he had received his title. But even small insects like us knew that captain was not a very exalted rank, and only a man with little else to boast about would hang on to it in civilian life. It was bad enough to keep calling yourself Major after it was all over, but Captain was the bottoms. Rumour had it that the constant twitching and jerking and snorting was caused by something called shell shock, but we were not quite sure what that was. We took it to mean that an explosive object had gone off very close to him with such an enormous bang that it had made him jump high in the air, and he hadn't stopped jumping since. For a reason that I could never properly understand, Captain Hardcastle had it in for me from the very first day at St. Peter's. Perhaps it was because he taught Latin and I was no good at it. Perhaps it was because already, at the age of 9, I was very nearly as tall as he was. Or even more likely, it was because I took an instant dislike to his giant orange moustache, and he often caught me staring at it with what was probably a little sneer under the nose. I had only to pass within 10 feet of him in the corridor, and he would glare at me and shout, "Hold yourself straight, boy. Pull your shoulders back." Or, "Take those hands out of your pockets." Or, "What's so funny, may I ask? What are you smirking at?" Or, most insulting of all, "You, what's your name? Get on with your work." I knew, therefore, that it was only a matter of time before the gallant captain nailed me good and proper. The crunch came during my second term when I was exactly 9.5, and it happened during evening prep. Every weekday evening, the whole school would sit for 1 hour in the main hall, between 6 and 7 o'clock, to do prep. The master on duty for the week would be in charge of prep, which meant that he sat high up on a dais at the top of the end of the hall and kept order. Some masters read a book while taking prep, and some corrected exercises, but not Captain Hardcastle. He would sit up there on the dais, twitching and grunting, and never once would he look down at his desk. His small milky blue eyes would rove the hall for the full 60 minutes, searching for trouble. And heaven help the boy who caused it. The rules of prep were simple but strict. You were forbidden to look up from your work, and you were forbidden to talk. That was all there was to it, but it left you precious little leeway. In extreme circumstances, and I never knew what these were, you could put your hand up and wait until you were asked to speak, but you had better be awfully sure that the circumstances were extreme. Only twice during my 4 years at St. Peter's did I see a boy putting his hand up during prep. The first one went like this: "Master, what is it?" Boy: "Please, sir, may I be excused to go to the lavatory?" Master: "Certainly not. You should have gone before." Boy: "But sir, please sir, I didn't want to before, I didn't know." Master: "Whose fault was that? Get on with your work." Boy: "But sir, oh sir, please sir, let me go." Master: "One more word out of you and you'll be in trouble." Naturally, the wretched boy dirtied his pants, which caused a storm later on upstairs with the matron. On the second occasion, I remember clearly that it was a summer term, and the boy who put his hand up was called Braithwaite. I also seem to recollect that the master taking prep was our friend Captain Hardcastle, but I wouldn't swear to it. The dialogue went something like this: Master: "Yes, what is it?" Braithwaite: "Please sir, a wasp came in through the window and it stung me on the lip and it's swelling up." Master: "A what?" Braithwaite: "A wasp, sir." Master: "Speak up, boy, I can't hear you. A what came in through the window?" Braithwaite: "It's hard to speak up, sir, with my lip all swelling up." Master: "With your what all swelling up? Are you trying to be funny?" Braithwaite: "No, sir, I promise not, sir." Master: "Talk properly, boy. What's the matter with you?" Braithwaite: "I've told you, sir. I've been stung, sir. My lip is swelling. It's hurting terribly." Master: "Hurting terribly? What's hurting terribly?" Braithwaite: "My lip, sir. It's getting bigger and bigger." Master: "What prep are you doing tonight?" Braithwaite: "French verbs, sir. We have to write them out." Master: "Do you write with your lip?" Braithwaite: "No, sir, I don't, sir, but you see, Master, all I see is that you're making an infernal noise and disturbing everybody in the room. Now get on with your work." They were tough, those masters, make no mistake about it, and if you wanted to survive, you had to become pretty tough yourself. My own turn came, as I said, during my second term, and Captain Hardcastle was again taking prep. You should know that during prep, every boy in the hall sat in his own small individual wooden desk. These desks had the usual sloping wooden tops with a narrow flat strip at the far end where there was a groove to hold your pen and a small hole in the right-hand side in which the inkwell sat. The pens we used had detachable nibs, and it was necessary to dip your nib into the inkwell every 6 or 7 seconds when you were writing. Ballpoint pens and felt pens had not been yet invented, and fountain pens were forbidden. The nibs we used were very fragile, and most boys kept a supply of new ones in a small box in their trouser pocket. Prep was in progress. Captain Hardcastle was sitting up on the dais in front of us, stroking his orange moustache, twitching his head and grunting through his nose. His eyes roved the hall endlessly, searching for mischief. The only noises to be heard were Captain Hardcastle's little snorting grunts and the soft sound of pen nibs moving over paper. Occasionally there was a ping as somebody dipped his nib too violently into his tiny white porcelain inkwell. Disaster struck when I foolishly stubbed the tip of my nib into the top of the desk. The nib broke. I knew I hadn't got a spare one in my pocket, but a broken nib was never accepted as an excuse for not finishing prep. We had been set an essay to write, and the subject was The Life Story of a Penny. I still have that essay in my files. I had made a decent start, and I was rattling along fine when I broke that nib. There was still another half hour of prep to go, and I couldn't sit there doing nothing all that time. Nor could I put my hand up and tell Captain Hardcastle I'd broken my nib. I simply did not dare, and as a matter of fact, I really wanted to finish that essay. I knew exactly what was going to happen to my penny through the next 2 pages, and I couldn't bear to leave it unsaid. I glanced to my right. The boy next to me was called Dobson. He was the same age as me, 9.5, and a nice fellow. Even now, 60 years later, I can still remember that Dobson's father was a doctor, and that he lived, as I had learned from the label on Dobson's tuck box, at the Red House, Uxbridge, Middlesex. Dobson's desk was almost touching mine. I thought I would risk it. I kept my head lowered, but watched Captain Hardcastle very carefully. When I was fairly sure he was looking the other way, I put a hand in front of my mouth and whispered, Dobson, could you lend me a nib? Suddenly there was an explosion up on the dais. Captain Hardcastle had leapt to his feet and was pointing at me, shouting, "You're talking! I saw you talking! Don't try to deny it! I distinctly saw you talking behind your hand!" I sat there frozen with terror. Every boy stopped working and looked up. Captain Hardcastle's face had gone from red to deep purple, and he was twitching violently. "Do you deny you were talking?" he shouted. "No, sir, no, but..." "And do you deny you were trying to cheat? Do you deny that you were asking Dobson for the help with your work?" No, sir, I wasn't cheating." "Of course you were cheating. Why else, may I ask, would you be speaking to Dobson? I take it you were not inquiring after his health?" It is worth reminding the reader once again of my age. I was not a self-possessed lad of 14, nor was I 12 or even 10 years old. I was 9.5, and at that age, one is ill-equipped to tackle a grown-up man with flaming orange hair and a violent temper. One can do little else but stutter. I have broken my nib, sir," I whispered. I was asking Dobson if he could lend me one, sir." "You're lying," cried Captain Hardcastle, and there was a triumph in his voice. "I always knew you were a liar, and a cheat as well. All I wanted was a nib, sir." "I'd shut up if I were you," thundered the voice on the dais. "You'll only get yourself into deeper trouble. I'm giving you a stripe." Those were words of doom. A stripe. I'm giving you a stripe. All around, I could feel a kind of sympathy reaching out from every boy in that school, but nobody moved or made a sound. Here I must explain the system of stars and stripes that we had at St. Peter's. For exceptionally good work, you could be awarded a quarter star, and a red dot was made with crayon beside your name on the notice board. If you got 4 quarter stars, a red line was drawn through the 4 dots, indicating that you had completed a star. For exceptionally poor work or bad behaviour, you were given a stripe, and that automatically meant a thrashing from the headmaster. Every master had a book of quarter stars and a book of stripes, and these had to be filled in and signed and torn out exactly like checks from a checkbook. The quarter stars were pink, the stripes were a fiendish blue-green colour. The boy who received a star or a stripe would pocket it until the following morning after prayers, when the headmaster would call upon anyone who had been given one or the other to come forward in front of the whole school and hand it in. Stripes were considered so dreadful that they were not given very often. In any one week, it was unusual for more than 2 or 3 boys to be given stripes. And now Captain Hardcastle was giving one to me. "Come here," he ordered. I got up from my desk and walked up to the dais. He already had his book of stripes on the desk and was filling one out. He was using red ink, and along the line where it said reason, he wrote, "Talking in prep, trying to cheat, and lying." He signed it and tore it off out of the book. Then, taking plenty of time, he filled in the counterfoil. He picked up the terrible piece of green-blue paper and waved it in my direction, but he didn't look up. I took it out of his hand and walked back to my desk. The eyes of the whole school followed my progress. For the remainder of prep, I sat at my desk and did nothing. Having no nib, I was unable to write another word about the life story of a penny, but I was made to finish it the next afternoon instead of playing games. The following morning, as soon as prayers were over, the headmaster called for quarter stars and stripes. I was the only boy to go up. The assistant masters were sitting on very uptight chairs on either side of the headmaster, and I caught a glimpse of Captain Hardcastle, arms folded across his chest, head twitching, the milky blue eyes watching me intently, the look of triumph still glimmering on his face. I handed in my stripe. The headmaster took it and read the writing. "Come and see me in my study," he said, "as soon as this is over." 5 minutes later, walking on my toes and trembling terribly, I passed through the green baize door and entered the sacred precincts where the headmaster lived. I knocked on his study door. "Enter!" I turned the knob and went into this large square room with bookshelves and easy chairs and a gigantic desk topped in red leather straddling the far corner. The headmaster was sitting behind the desk holding my stripe in his fingers. "What have you got to say for yourself?" he asked me, and the white shark's teeth flashed dangerously between his lips. "I didn't lie, sir," I said. "I promise I didn't, and I wasn't trying to cheat." "Captain Hardcastle says you were doing both," the headmaster said. "And are you calling Captain Hardcastle a liar?" "No, sir. Oh, no, sir. I wouldn't if I were you. I had a broken nib, sir, and I was asking Dobson if he could lend me another." "That is not what Captain Hardcastle says. He says you were asking for help with your essay." "Oh, no, sir, I wasn't. I was a long way away from Captain Hardcastle, and I was only whispering. I don't think he could have heard what I said, sir." "So you are calling him a liar?" "Oh, no, sir, I would never do that." It was impossible for me to win against the headmaster. What would I like to have said was, "Yes, sir, if you really want to know, sir, I am calling Captain Hardcastle a liar, because that's what he is." But it was out of the question. I did, however, had one trump card left to play, or I thought I did. "You could ask Dobson, sir," I whispered. "Ask Dobson?" he cried. "Why should I ask Dobson?" "He would tell you what I said, sir." "Captain Hardcastle is an officer and a gentleman," the headmaster said. "He's told me what happened. I hardly think I want to go around asking some silly little boy if Captain Hardcastle is speaking the truth." I kept silent. "For talking and prep," the headmaster went on, "for trying to cheat and for lying, I'm going to give you 6 strokes of the cane." He rose from his desk and crossed over to the corner cupboard on the opposite side of the study. He reached up and took from the top of it 3 very thin yellow canes, each with a bent-over handle at one end. For a few seconds he held them in his hands, examining them with some care, and then he selected one and replaced the other 2 on top of the cupboard. "Bend over." I was frightened of that cane. There is no small boy in the world who wouldn't be. It wasn't simply an instrument for beating you. It was a weapon for wounding. It lacerated the skin. It caused severe black and scarlet bruising that took 3 weeks to disappear. And all the time during those 3 weeks you could feel your heart beating along the wounds. I tried once more, my voice slightly hysterical now. "I didn't do it, sir. I swear I'm telling the truth." "Be quiet and bend over there, and touch your toes." Very slowly I bent over. Then I shut my eyes and braced myself for the first crack. Crack! It was like a rifle shot. With a very hard stroke of the cane on one's buttocks, the time lag before you feel any pain is about 4 seconds. Thus, the experienced caner will always pause between strokes to allow the agony to reach its peak. So for a few seconds after the first crack, I felt virtually nothing. Then suddenly came the frightful, searing, agonizing, unbearable burning across the buttocks. And as it reached the highest and most excruciating point, the second crack came down. I clutched hold of my ankles as tight as I could, and I bit into my lower lip. I was determined not to make a sound, for that would only give the executioner great satisfaction. Crack! 5 seconds pause. Crack! Another pause. Crack! And another pause. I was counting the strokes, and as the 6th one hit me, I knew I was going to survive in silence. "That'll do," the voice behind me said. I straightened up and clutched my backside as hard as I possibly could with both hands. This was always the instinctive and automatic reaction. The pain is so frightful, you try to grab hold of it and tear it away, and the tighter you squeeze, the more it helps. I did not look at the headmaster as I hopped across the thick red carpet towards the door. The door was closed, and nobody else was about to open it for me, so for a couple of seconds I had to let go of my bottom with one hand to turn the doorknob. Then I was out and hopping around in the hallway of the private sanctum. Directly across the hall from the headmaster's study was the assistant master's common room. They were all in there now, waiting to spread out to their respective classrooms. But what I couldn't help noticing, even in my agony, was that this door was open. Why was it open? Had it been left that way on purpose so that they could all hear more clearly the sound of the cane from across the hall? Of course it had. And I felt quite sure that it was Captain Hardcastle who had opened it. I pictured him standing in there amongst his colleagues and snorting with satisfaction at every stinging stroke. Small boys can be very comradely when a member of their community has gotten into trouble, and even more so when they feel an injustice has been done. When I returned to the classroom, I was surrounded on all sides by sympathetic faces and voices. But one particular incident has always stayed with me. A boy of my own age, called Hayden, was so violently incensed by the whole affair that he said to me before lunch that day, "You don't have a father. I do. I'm going to write to my father and tell him what has happened, and he'll do something about it." "He couldn't do anything," I said. "Oh yes he could," Hayden said. "And what's more, he will. My father won't let them get away with this." "Where is he now?" "He's in Greece," Hayden said, "in Athens, but that won't make any difference." Then and there, little Hayden sat down and wrote to the father he admired so much, but of course nothing came of it. It was nevertheless a touching and generous gesture from one small boy to another, and I have never forgotten it.